You're listening to ABC Radio and Help Me, I'm a Comedian. This is a show where we ask a comedian to come in and share something that's difficult or painful that's happened to them, and a psychologist tries to offer some advice and insight into that issue. So you're joined today by comedian Gordon Southern and psychologist Dr. Rachel Hannam. Hello to you both.
Hi, Ashwin.
Gordon, you, when we talked on the phone about this interview, said you had quite a charmed life until 2016, and then things changed that year. Can you tell me about that year?
Well, I think it's also your perception of how things have gone, but objectively, it was a pretty bad year, a cluster fudge of just things all coming together. So, first of all, my marriage began to break down, and that was in April of 2016. My wife just said, "That's enough, I'm done with you." And then that became a process of us separating, living together separately because she needed to transition away from the home that we lived in. And so that took about 2 years, then the divorce, and that was, financially a bit stressful. Simultaneously, my father's health began to decline quite rapidly. He had dementia, which gradually robbed him of his senses, and that became quite a strain on especially Mum, but also my sister and I. And that process came to an end in 2019 when he died. And also, I had some health issues of my own. I had arthritis in my right hip, which meant that just existing was quite painful. And I was put on some painkillers, but eventually I needed to have my right hip replaced, also in 2019. So that was 2016, became quite a long year in terms of hardship as I perceived it. And then, in a wider sort of sense, I felt that politically the world had gone crazy because we had Brexit, which happened in 2016, and Trump coming into power in America. And I just went, I don't know what to do with all of this information.
So a lot of bleak events happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
What effect did that have on you?
It made me very sad. I think being in pain as well, you're kind of in that with the painkillers, and I was also self-medicating with alcohol, so I felt quite numb and sort of disconnected a lot of the time. And, just watching your dad slowly die is very difficult, and then not having the emotional support of a partner because she was becoming, distant as well, physically and emotionally.
Did you have an idea of your dad, not considering that he might be mortal and might pass on one day, because he's always been dad to you, and so it was so hard to...
I knew he was going to die, and I felt bad because the condition that he had robbed him of his vitality, and it took him away. Yeah. So he wasn't my dad. He was this weird, I called him wee ghosty, because he was a sort of vague little Scottish cloud wafting around, not really knowing what he was doing. And then, of course, it just eroded my mum's spirit because she was his primary carer. And all she could do was check on him and make sure he's okay. My sister and I haven't had kids, and my mum always wanted to be a grandmother. And I started to think that with my father entering into this weird second childhood, he was filling that role.
As I watch my dad get older, he's just turned 80 now, and you realise he's not going to be around forever. And I haven't had children either. I wonder what it's going to be like for me to be an 80-year-old man living on the other side of the world with no kids, no family and friends around. Did you ever entertain the idea of loneliness, being someone without kids and watching your dad go through that?
I suppose so, yeah. I mean, I put that in the try not to think about it basket. I don't know how I'm going to be an old person. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us what the life of a touring comic is like?
Well, it's objectively glamorous, but there's a degree of drudgery and tedium and a lot of loneliness, actually. It's very interesting how occasionally you have this sense of, I'm on my adventures, I'm a comedian, I'm travelling, I'm touring. I feel so very alone. So there's two sides to it. Yeah, I went full-time in 98. Before that, I was doing a lot of radio comedy, and so mostly based in London. But then as the stand-up career took off, I found myself more and more often on the road. And so my life was... My relationships were generally with people who did the same thing. So I dated other comedians for a while. And then in 2004, my first ever trip to Australia, I met and fell in love with a clown, a children's entertainer who became my future ex-wife. And for a while, it was kind of, we'd do it not quite together, because she would, at some festivals, she'd be working in the day doing the kid shows, and I'd do the grown-up shows at night.
Yeah.
I'd also often get roped into the kid shows as an extra, as a, you know, just someone to move some scenery around, or a bear that plays the drums, or an elephant who turns up at the end. Oh, I'm the elephant that they've been talking about all this time.
Did you enjoy that?
It felt like a duty,
All right, okay.
but it also meant that I wouldn't be too hungover on the weekends because I knew I had to play the drums and listen to screaming kids.
Yeah. Also, like a stand-up comedian marrying a clown, or it's almost like interracial relationships were in the 1940s. You've crossed the divide.
I crossed the divide.
But I want to take you back to 2016. So you also talked about your marriage broke down that year. Was that a surprise to you, or had you seen it coming?
It was a relief, if anything, because I think the writing was on the wall. We had been together for 7 years, but we didn't spend that much time together because I would often be on the road, and then every December she'd go to Adelaide without me to set up a show that she was running there. So we'd have Christmas with my family at the end of November, and then off she'd go, and then I'd do Christmas shows all through December, which was very dispiriting but lucrative. And that would then be the little sort of cash stash that would get me off to Australia. But then when I got to Australia, I'd hit the road straight away. So sometimes it would be really weird. Like I'd see her for a few days here and there, and then we'd do festivals together. And of course, festivals, everyone's running around. So we didn't really have that much quality time together. And even when we went on holiday, it would often be like, oh, I've picked up these gigs in Thailand. Do you want to come?
Right.
So there'd be some sort of work agenda. So I think I'd often put my career first.
Yeah.
And that would be dispiriting for her.
There is a science to successful long-term relationships. You can't really feel connected if you don't spend any time together. Another big thing is empathy. If couples can have respect and empathy for one another, be kind to one another when they're stressed, when they're struggling, not just criticism, but criticism on steroids is contempt, and it's the biggest relationship killer. So empathy is the antidote to that, and you've got to work hard at that.
Is there something else about having a common project? Like a lot of couples have kids and the kids become the project. If you don't have kids, do you need to find another project that unites you?
Yeah, I mean, the cliche of having things in common is very true. You don't have to have everything in common, but some common interests is another big predictor of success, yeah.
After 2016, Gordon, you decided to go and see some therapists.
Yeah.
To process what you'd been through. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I was lucky and unlucky. Very lucky that I had the opportunity and the option to see a therapist. Some people just don't have that. But I didn't choose wisely, with the benefit of hindsight. Well, it wasn't really my fault. But I had one therapist who I would call of the nodding dog school, that she goes, okay, well, tell me about your life, and then would just nod at me while I spoke. And I'm there going, when do you make any input? And she'd just quietly sit there. And then I said, what do you think about that? And she goes, well, how does it make you feel? And I go, you smashed it across the net back to me. But the very fact that I was doing the therapy was beneficial, in the same way that if you feel ill, just by going to the doctor makes you feel better.
Rachel, I want to ask you a question that's related to this, is that I've heard that, maybe I haven't given you any notice about this question, but the brain has dopamine circuits. And when our plans get interrupted, it interrupts our emotional circuits. So we were planning to do X today, and then suddenly a curveball comes, and now we're anxious, and it's not easy to have our plans interrupted.
Oh, you're describing the last 18 months.
The last 18, yeah, exactly. And you've had so many curveballs. Your life as a comedian is full of curveballs because there's random gigs and interruptions and changes coming at you.
Yeah.
So I'd like to explore this issue of interruption and not having a steady, stable life. You know, what kind of impact that has on you. So can you explain for you, and then I'll get Rachel to comment as a therapist.
That's made my head spin because I'd never make 5-year plans, which I think successful comedians possibly do. I would, up until a few years ago, my agent in the UK would just fill my diary and I would do those shows, and there was a sense of continuity and stability and, I guess, job security.
Yeah.
And then COVID hit and everything just went a little bit haywire. I decided to stay in Australia, which for a year was the correct choice because London, Great Britain, everything shut down. It was chaos. All my comedy friends had to retrain or just burn through their savings. And I was working, and I felt very lucky and privileged, did comedy festivals.
And you didn't get COVID?
I didn't get COVID. My sister got it. She got real sick back in the UK. And you know, you're hearing stories. And then in June of last year, Australia, there was like a hemispherical shift of America and Europe going, right, we've dealt with COVID. It's killed who it's going to kill. Let's get back to work. And then Australia went, oh no, we can't eradicate COVID. We're going to have this rolling barrage of lockdowns. And I felt very rudderless through all of that because my diary, I don't cross things out in my diary. I just put an X next to them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of not healthy because it's like, oh, well, this is what I could have been doing.
Rachel, can you comment on that as a therapist? What effect does it have on us to have our plans interrupted so frequently?
Well, we get fatigued and weary from all of the changes and interruptions. I mean, humans are a beautiful combination of wanting stability and predictability and security, but also wanting kind of novelty. And so when that balance gets out of whack, and everybody's got their own sort of sense of what their own balance is with those two disparate needs, you know, you can wind up with what we call an adjustment disorder in psychology, which is where your ability to cope with the changes and the stress sort of is overwhelmed by what's going on. And so you can get symptoms of anxiety and depression and burnout.
During the various lockdowns that Australia's endured, walking, I would walk. I'd make a real point of it with my step counter. I'd walk 10 Ks every day because being a comedian means you're in a state of constant flux or motion, be it driving on a train, on an aeroplane, or the ultimate one, a cruise ship, which is a resort in which you work that is in a constant state of motion.
Yes.
And so I missed that rhythm,
Yeah.
so I started walking. And I'd have the headphones on with either an audiobook or just a bit of music.
Yeah.
Or if I wanted to torture myself, some comedy shows from the BBC in the UK going, oh, I wish that was me.
Yeah. I feel like we used to know this as a culture. Our religions are full of yin and yang, God and the devil, chaos and order. But now that most of us aren't very religious, we've forgotten that we should incorporate a bit of both in our lives. Do you have any kind of spiritual path, or has comedy become your spiritual path?
I've been in some group therapy sessions where religion is a feature, and I now have an understanding of what I think God is. I think God is other people, and you know, that support network that you have is what I understand God to be.
Yeah.
I was never religious. In fact, my mum says that when I was about 5 years old, she took me to a church, and I went full Damien from The Omen, just not quite a spinning head, but I just cracked off like, and she took, and with shame, she took me from the church, put me in the car, strapped me in, and said, "Okay, I'm never taking you to church again."
You're listening to ABC Radio with psychologist Dr. Rachel Hannam and comedian Gordon Southern on Help Me, I'm a Comedian. Gordon, you mentioned earlier that God is other people. Now, you've been troubled by the last few years of politics. It's taken a conservative turn over much of the planet, and you've talked about maybe finding a new home for yourself. So we talked earlier about the concept of being an ideological refugee, where your country doesn't match you anymore. Can you tell me about that?
I was very troubled by the Brexit farrago of, I think, 2016. I live in Lambeth, and we voted 76% to remain in Europe, which is the correct thing to do. I think politically, ideologically, and also in terms of there was a bubbling sense of racism and xenophobia that was fueling the Leave Europe agenda. And the people who wanted to leave Europe tended to be white, tended to be right-wing, and seemed to have some self-serving agenda, which has, as Brexit has unfolded, proven to be true. So there's food shortages, fuel shortages, labour shortages, all things that I predicted because I was paying attention. Yeah. And personally, I started doing gigs. And if you're in sort of remote communities in England and you start talking about Brexit, I can actually feel waves of hate and antipathy and just minds snapping shut. And on one occasion, I was in King's Lynn, which is a market town in East Anglia, having a stand-up row in a car park with someone who just, one, wasn't really listening, but two, was a Brexiteer and wanted to tell me that I was wrong. And that hasn't happened in the past in my comedy career, to have that degree of polarisation and countryman against countryman.
Yes. Village against city, rural against urban. In some
Absolutely.
ways.
And also, you know, white versus multicultural as well, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt very disappointed. And so I went, oh, sod it, I'm going to go to Australia. Then you come to Australia, and that's even more right-wing, especially, you know, in places like northern Queensland.
Yeah, so what's the vibe like for you over there when you travel?
I find that Queensland is where I'll get the most argy-bargy at a gig.
Yeah.
Perth is a bit similar, and then, of course, you get Melbourne and Sydney who have that sort of, again, quite groovy, Europe-centric vibe.
What about Brisbane, though? Does it feel quite different to the rest of Queensland when you tour?
Well, I haven't been to the rest of Queensland in a long, long time, not since about 2005, so hard to say.
Okay.
You talked about wanting to please people earlier. How has it been for you to deal with that added level of hostility you now face?
I find it mind-boggling, and I think I told you the anecdote. I worked on a cruise ship in Europe, and it was all Americans. And I was doing some Trump jokes. I thought they were quite gentle, but a man stands up and he's like, I don't want to hear this. USA, USA. And he storms out, goes straight to reception and starts banging on about this English comedian. He's ruining my holiday, talking about Donald Trump. I need to speak to the entertainment manager. As luck would have it, the entertainment manager was a Mexican.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Rachel, what is this phenomenon where people don't feel comfortable in their own country? How important is it to feel like you belong in your country?
That's a really good question. I mean, this is just how I see it. But, you know, having an identity, I think it's good to have a larger sense of self. Like a global citizen is a pretty good identity. Yeah. When you come down to the level of a national identity, you know, it can be tricky, right? It can be good to really identify with your nationality to a point. But it's a bit like, let's treat it like you identify with your football team, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that I love, I don't love sport, I'm not a sports person, but this is an analogy that I love, and I talk to my clients about wanting without attachment. So when you love a team, say a football team, you really want them to win, right? But you're not so attached to the outcome that you're going to go and riot if they lose, right?
Some England fans do.
I know this doesn't. This is what some of my clients tell me. They're like, no, actually that is a thing. But for the most part, we want them to win. But, you know, if they lose, we go, they played a good game. You know, it was a tough game sort of thing. Uh-huh. And the psychology of that is what I call wanting without attachment. If only we could be like that, I like being Australian, but I also, you know, love other cultures, and I don't know if we could sort of be flexible, psychologically flexible around our preferences.
During the whole Brexit thing, I started to say to people, actually, I identify as a European.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to wind them up.
Or what about the yes and thing from improv, right? I'm British and I'm European and I'm human.
And I'm also Australian
And
now.
I'm also Australian. Yeah. Like, there's the psychological flexibility in that which we need.
Do you think there's an idea in Britain that it was a powerful country for so long, for 200 years, and now it has to take a smaller place in the world commensurate with its population, and that's hard for some British people to accept?
Well, I think it's fascinating because all the places I work are thanks to the British Empire, because I don't speak any other languages fluently. So I have to gig in Australia, America, Europe, where they all speak really good English, the Middle East, wherever there's oil, there's people who speak English. Yeah. So there's some gigs, I haven't done them, but Azerbaijan, loads of people speak English there because they need the engineers. So the British Empire has allowed me to travel the world and see a lot of different places.
What would you say have been insights that you've picked up? How is Gordon today different from 6 years ago? What have you learned from the tragedies that you've been through, the therapy that you've been through, whether comedy has worked or not to address that? What have you learned in those 5 years?
Oh my goodness. It's a lot of stuff from group therapy is that don't catastrophize. I've learnt that word, and it's a great word because as soon as you start to catastrophize, you go, what? Why not? Don't do that.
Yeah.
So do you want to define that for people?
Catastrophizing for me is having a situation that you're not happy about and then in your head playing it forward to the worst possible outcome and then believing that is the outcome that will happen. For example, having a bit of a cough, lung cancer, dead.
Yeah.
Reading the ABC News, stuck in Adelaide, can't do any gigs.
Partner doesn't text you back, they don't love me anymore.
Oh, I call my phone the resentment generation machine. Because as soon as you send an email or a text, I'm then looking at the phone going, well, why aren't they getting back to me? Like seconds later.
They don't love you anymore.
Exactly. And then you have to go, well, maybe they're busy. Maybe they don't check their phone as habitually as I do.
Right.
What do we need to know about catastrophizing, Rachel?
Well, everybody does it. This is evolution, right? I mean, think of our ancestors hunting and gathering. A little rustle in the bushes could be nothing, could be a deadly snake. You know, jump to the worst possible conclusion, get out of there, survive, pass on your genes. Blip on the horizon, could be nothing, could be a woolly mammoth. Get out of there, pass on this negativity bias, this tendency to catastrophize to your predecessors, and they're more likely statistically to survive. This is why everybody does it, because we are hardwired to jump to the worst possible conclusions. But once you know that this is what the mind does, then you can develop a relationship with your mind's automatic instincts, and you don't have to be hijacked by them anymore.
See, I was told that recently, almost word for word, but there was a tiger in the story. So a rustle in the bushes, you go, is it the wind or is it a tiger? And your brain goes,
Tiger.
Just in case it's a tiger, I'm going to run. But then you have to go, in my experience, every time there's been a rustle in the bushes, it's been the wind. I've never yet encountered a tiger. I mean, today might be the day.
That seems to reinforce the idea that our brains aren't designed for our happiness. They're just designed to keep us alive.
Oh, contented Homo erectus got eaten, didn't they?
Exactly.
Oh, the happy ones are no longer with us.
That's right.
They're in a tiger's tummy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. When we're full of adrenaline or emotionally flooded, as psychologists say, we have a lot of trouble getting perspective. We are in survival mind. We are thinking there's a tiger. So anything that regulates our nervous system, like swimming, like walking, which you mentioned, other exercise, for some people prayer, for some people meditation, we're all different, helps bring down the adrenaline levels. And in that more emotionally regulated state, we can think more clearly.
Yeah.
And then we can stop catastrophizing.
You were saying you should spend 6 hours of quality time with another person. I think you should have 6 hours of quality time with yourself as well a week. For me, that's most of Saturday. Just me, the park, my shoes off, and it's quite rejuvenating to just not have any plans, no agenda that day. Gordon, do you spend enough time alone recuperating?
I don't think I do. I'm strange because I crave solitude, but then when I get it, I start twiddling my thumbs a bit. And one thing I do to keep the adrenaline level up, which I have to stop doing, is I call it doom scrolling, where you either get social media or my favourite one is toggling between the ABC and the BBC News websites and trying to find something awful that's happening and then worry about it, knowing full well that I can't fix it.
Does your current life provide all those things Rachel mentioned, that meaning and the warmth of good relationships? And if it doesn't, are you planning on changing anything?
I'm working on it. So this week, and I've been really blessed. I've managed to hang out with people who I know in the area and have lunch with someone different every day. And if I do that, it's a good day. And if I get to swim, it's a good day. If I neglect to do these things, I'm twiddling my thumbs, loneliness starts to creep in, self-doubt, and the self-doubt then becomes a catastrophe. And all of that is, in a few minutes, just being alone with your thoughts. Yeah. Going, what's the worst possible thing that I could do with my time? And generally it's, watching the news and going, well, that's the year ruined.
Yeah.
It's a bit out of vogue now, but there was a therapy, very simple, neat little idea. And the phrase for it was behavioural activation therapy. And it's such a simple idea. It sounds so fancy. Just do something. Just in terms of managing the mad monkey mind that catastrophizes, in terms of managing your own physiology, And I ask clients to do this. Anyone listening can do this. Make 2 lists. Make one list of things that need doing and one list of things that are pleasant to do. So swimming, seeing a friend, getting a massage, these could all go on your pleasant activities list. And then doing your tax return, cleaning the garage, whatever else could go on the needs. Because guaranteed, almost guaranteed, after you tick some things off those lists, you're going to feel better.
Yes.
Even if it's just a few % better. And so instead of sitting marinating in your negative thoughts, go do something and you'll feel better. And this is so true. And we all know it and we forget.
My girlfriend does this great thing. Usually around 4 in the afternoon, I'll start pacing around in the apartment in Adelaide and she'll just look at me and go, walkies?
Like
and it's like I've got the lead in my mouth almost. And it's like, okay, I'll be back in an hour. And I do a circuit because we live near the parklands. That's beautiful. So a circuit, bit of greenery.
Yeah.
How many % better do you feel afterwards?
Couldn't put a number on it, but certainly better.
Significant.
Yeah.
Do something, but also make space in your week to do nothing.
Rest. Well, that's right. We need to find our own rhythm between activity and rest.
Gordon, what are you planning next with your comedy?
Well, I'm doing 2 shows next year. I'm doing a show called The Longest Year because 2020 really is dragging on for me and for everyone, I think. And then I'm reviving the show That Boy Needs Therapy because even though my therapists were catastrophically, inappropriate at times, I got a lot out of the process. So it's a show about, men's mental health and suicide prevention, which I think is a good thing.
And I have seen his show and I really valued that about it, that you did normalise being a man, seeking help and support for your mental health and talking about dark thoughts and feelings. And I could feel in the audience that there was a poignancy.
And when I took the show to Scotland, it was interesting because, they have a real, tough man exterior. And to see some blokes just go, I can't believe he's talking about it. It was amazing.
Yeah. New Zealanders have got that staunchness as well, don't they?
Possibly, yeah.
So if you do live a naturally chaotic life, like a comedian's life or an artist's life, what are some steps you can take to make it less anxious for you?
Well, I think this is where if your life is, there's a lot of diversity and variety and unpredictability, then getting routines through exercise, through meditation, through, this is the night that I do this, that I play basketball or whatever, so that you've got some routine to contain the chaos, I think is a good idea.
You've been listening to Help Me, I'm a Comedian. I'm Ashwin Segkar, and you've also been hearing from comedian Gordon Southern and psychologist Dr. Rachel Hannam.